We now have Caleb Maupin, who's from the United States, who's a journalist and political analyst, and the founder of the Center for Political Innovation. And his topic is Sanctions against Syria, Conflict with China, Who Benefits?
Greetings, friends. I want to thank you for the opportunity of addressing this very important web conference about the topic of Syria and the need to end the criminal sanctions imposed on the country by the United States and the need for the United States to change its policies and how it relates to countries around the world. Syria is a country that is led by the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party. And the Ba'ath Party of Syria, its name, Ba'ath, literally means renaissance or rebirth in Arabic. And the policies of the Ba'ath Party have been dedicated to raising the population from poverty, improving living standards, and restoring the very proud history of the Arab people and advancing human civilization. Now, if you want to look for evidence of the success of the Syrian government and its policies, you can look at sources like the Avincia Journal of Medicine. The Avincia Journal of Medicine reports that from 1970 to 2009, the life expectancy in Syria increased by 17 years. During this time, the rate of infant mortality decreased from 132 deaths per 1,000 live births to only 17.9 deaths per live births. Another great source of information about the Syrian Arab Republic and what it has done to help the population is the country study published by the U.S. Library of Congress. According to the country study, in 1981, 42% of Syria's adult population was illiterate. But by 1991, illiteracy in Syria had been wiped out. The country study, published by the U.S. Library of Congress, also praises the Syrian government for its efforts to build infrastructure and provide economic opportunity. The U.S. Library of Congress country study writes, massive expenditures for the development of irrigation, electricity, water, road building projects, and the expansion of health services and education to rural areas contributed to prosperity during the 1980s in Syria. It's worth noting that the Soviet Union was a significant ally of Syria during the 1980s. Over $100 million was spent on hydroelectrical power plants that were constructed in the country. Over 900 Soviet technicians went to Syria to aid in the process of electrifying the country. Huge strides have been made in Syria to create a modern country. In Syria, you have different religious groups, Sunnis, Shias, Alawites, Christians, living together in peace, united by a secular government. In Syria, you have labor unions in the factories. You have different parties represented in the government. Syria remains one of the most modern and democratic governments in the region. However, rather than befriending this government, the leaders of the United States have been determined to overthrow the Syrian government. They have aligned themselves with some of the most reactionary forces in the region, Wahhabi extremists who seek to bring back the 1400s, who seek to carry out sectarian religious warfare. The Christian community of Syria, the Alawite community of Syria, other religious minorities, as well as the overall Sunni majority in Syria, have rejected these moves. But yet, the drive to remove the Syrian government, Assad must go, as was stated by the Obama administration, those sentiments seem to be very well alive in the circles of power. And now, in their continuing efforts to destabilize the country and prolong a horrendous war, these criminal sanctions on Syria continue. The Biden administration is carrying them out. And it's worth noting that the result of the efforts to violently overthrow the Syrian government has not only been creating millions of refugees, but it has been making Americans less safe. ISIL, or ISIS, or Daesh, or whatever you want to refer to them as, that horrendous terrorist group is a result of U.S. efforts to overthrow the Syrian government. These groups were armed and trained, and many of the so-called moderate rebels who were supported by the US government ended up joining the ISIL terrorist campaign, arming extremists and arming religious fanatics to overthrow the Syrian government has had catastrophic results, as we've seen all across the world. Now, it's also worth noting that Syria is very close to China. And in fact, the Jamestown Foundation wrote in 2007 that hundreds of millions of dollars have been invested in Syria in order to modernize the country's aging oil and gas infrastructure. And that the policy of trying to destabilize and overthrow the Syrian government with crippling sanctions by arming extremists, it mirrors the trade war against China. China is also a country that has lifted itself up, taken control of its economy, forced the economy to serve the nation overall, and raised millions of people from poverty. In China, there have been many huge power plants constructed. In fact, the biggest power plant, the biggest hydroelectrical power plant, I should say, in the world is the Three Gorges Dam. And it was created by the Chinese Communist Party. 800 million people have been lifted from poverty. At this point, China has the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. And not too long ago, China was known as the sick man of Asia. The turning around of China from being a deeply impoverished country into being an economic superpower is one of the most beautiful stories in the 20th and 21st century. And it is deeply, deeply mistaken on the part of our leaders to set up a situation of hostility with China. Joe Biden's recent speech, where he talked about the need to, quote, win against China in the 21st century, made me think the 21st century is not a horse race. We need to stop viewing politics in terms of zero-sum game, in terms of one country can only win at the expense of another. It is certainly not in the interest of the United States, with so much mass unemployment, with so much crumbling infrastructure, to cut itself off from the massive amount of growth that China is leading. China is not only helping itself to expand, but all across the world, China is building power plants, it's building hospitals, it's building roads, it's building infrastructure. China is trading with countries throughout Asia, throughout Africa, all with the aim of raising them up out of poverty. Win-win cooperation. My hope is that U.S. leaders will abandon their policy of trying to destabilize Syria, and that U.S. leaders will also abandon the policy of trying to escalate tensions with China. There's only one human family. There's only one global community. And the more we are cooperating with each other around things like technological development, poverty alleviation, eliminating the scourge of drug addiction and terrorism, the better the world will be. U.S. policy toward Syria, U.S. policy toward Russia, toward Venezuela, toward Iran, toward China, toward many countries is deeply problematic. The road to peace, the road to raising countries out of poverty, the road to a better world for all, the road toward eliminating terrorism and narco gangs is the road of international cooperation. So this is the message that we largely need to communicate to our friends, to our co-workers, to everyone we know. We need to explain that sanctions are economic warfare. They destroy people's lives. They prevent people from getting access to medical care. They hurt ordinary people. And the human rights rhetoric used to justify them is often laced with hypocrisy. The U.S. government claims to be a supporter of democracy, but we see them aligned with the government of Colombia that is shooting people down in the streets. We see them aligned with the austerity regime of Haiti. We see them aligned with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with its public beheadings and its autocratic monarchy. Human rights rhetoric should not be used to wage economic warfare against independent countries, no matter where they are in the world. So let's hope that our conference today can play an important role, not only in educating people, but also in perhaps changing the tone of discourse and setting the stage for a new direction in U.S. policy, where instead of tearing down countries with sanctions, we are cooperating with them to do what's necessary as we look ahead toward a brighter future.
And Helga, you wanted to say something on.
Yeah, I just personally think having watched the rapprochement between Russia and China. I mean, they know that the whole game is, to either work with Russia to get rid of China or vice versa, depending which faction there is. But I don't think that the chances to sabotage the present very close collaboration is there, because both of them are very much aware that together there is a chance to define a completely new set of international relations, which in the best case includes the United States, and that if they are divided, then all of them are looking, and the whole world looks much worse. So I'm confident that this alliance will not be able to sabotage.
And Caleb, you wanted to say something on that?
Well, it's interesting because in one of the first interviews that Donald Trump gave during his presidential campaign when he was running with Bill O'Reilly, he said that you can't have Russia and China together, and Barack Obama has done that. And he criticized the Obama administration for driving Russia and China closer together. But at this point, I think the reason that it's going to be impossible to divide Russia and China against each other is because they're really an economic match made in, the way Putin rescued the economy of Russia from the disaster following the fall of the Soviet Union was by recentering the economy around Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-controlled energy companies, a natural gas company and an oil company. And China has become a booming center of industry. The world's top producer of steel, half the steel in the world is made in China, the world's top producer of copper, etc. China needs lots of natural gas and lots of oil to run its economy. Meanwhile, Russia needs to sell lots of oil and lots of natural gas. So pulling the two countries apart would be very difficult. During the Cold War, the United States very much was able to manipulate the differences between the Soviet Union and China. And it was largely, there were political, ideological differences, et cetera. But this is not the Cold War. This isn't an ideological fight between capitalism and communism. This is rather about economics. And Russia and China are closely tied together economically. And the more sanctions and the more hostility that the United States pours onto both countries, the more that they are going to be tied together economically. And you can say the same for Iran. You can say the same for Venezuela. The more sanctions that are imposed on these countries, the more close-knit they become with each other. And so you have to ask the question, are these sanctions really benefiting the long-term policy of the United States? Because at the end of the day, it's driving the countries that are targeted closer together. It's building more and more of an alternative on the global international economy. And it's simply leading to the United States being locked out of a lot of the growth and development that's happening in the world.
Anyone else with some thoughts on that? Well, okay, Caleb.
Sure. Well, it appears to me that it may be part of the strategy of the anti-China faction in the United States to try and provoke a military confrontation. The strategy may be to provoke a situation where China feels that it has to militarily retake Taiwan, so then China can be castigated as the aggressor. And that this is something that Zbigniew Brzezinski and other foreign policy strategists in the United States have long tried to figure out is how can we create a situation where we accuse the country we're going after, and we can frame them as the aggressor. This is very similar to what was done with the situation with Ukraine and Crimea. They staged events in a way to make Russia look as if they were the aggressor in Crimea. And I think that is the aim. I noticed the Economist magazine, they had the cover had Taiwan, and it said the most dangerous place in the world. They're already playing up this notion that aggressive, expansive China is ready to retake Taiwan. And this is part of the strategy, make China look like the aggressor so they can then escalate the sanctions and economic warfare.
We're running a little short on time, so I have a question here that maybe everyone would like to comment on. Some of you have mentioned the importance of bringing the public into the discussion over the war danger. There are a few people who are raising it, as we mentioned at the beginning, Helga, in your presentation. But how do we create a broad public debate on the danger of war? If you remember in the 1980s, you had the debate going on in Europe over the SS-20 missiles, the U.S. Weapons in Germany. And then we had around the Strategic Defense Initiative, Lyndon LaRouche's proposal, quite a debate going on in the United States. But today it's mostly silent. How can we bring more people into this and give them an understanding or create an understanding for the elected officials that the population must be considered when you take up these questions of war and peace? So I'd like each of you to say something on that, starting with Caleb. You want to say something?
Sure. The most disturbing thing about Joe Biden's joint address to the Congress was the fact that he framed his calls for infrastructure and his calls for a jobs guarantee and his repudiation of trickle-down economics. He lined it up with U.S. foreign policy being aggressive. He said we need to win against China in the 21st century. And somehow the way politics is being shifted, there's this whole rise of, left-wing folks on the internet and young people getting interested in left-wing ideas. But it's being framed up that to be a good little leftist, to be a good little socialist in the United States, you need to be very, very hostile to China. You need to be very, very hostile to Russia. You need to be repeating the U.S. foreign policy talking points about whatever country we're supposed to be demonizing. And that is very disturbing. It used to be that leftists were known as the anti-war people, and it was the right that were considered to be the war hawks. But now things have gotten very confusing. And in Joe Biden's speech, he actually went as far as trying to link the events of January 6th with countries around the world the U.S. is hostile to. He used the term autocracy and insurrection, trying to link in people's minds the events of January 6th with governments around the world, and that if you are going to be supportive of Joe Biden's economic agenda of supposedly building infrastructure, let's wait to see what he actually does, that in order to be a good supporter of it, you should be a vicious war hawk and want to escalate tension with countries around the world. And that's very, very disturbing. And I think that needs to be challenged. I think there are many people that maybe voted for Biden or maybe have a left-wing persuasion that don't buy into that logic. And that argument that somehow wanting economic progressive policies at home lines up with wanting war abroad, that needs to be broadly challenged.